They weren't expected to survive. They were expected to scream, charge, and die. From kamikaze pilots crashing into battleships to infantrymen pulling the pin on grenades clutched to their chests, Japan's W.Put soldiers were trained to sacrifice everything, even their own lives, without hesitation. But why? This video uncovers the disturbing truth behind Japan's military doctrine of death before surrender, revealing the psychological conditioning, cultural traditions, and brutal battlefield tactics that made dying an act of honor, and survival a shameful betrayal. To understand why Japanese soldiers were trained to die screaming, we need to go back centuries, long before World War II, to the heart of the samurai warrior tradition. Central to that ethos was the Bushido Code, a system of honor that glorified loyalty, obedience, and death before dishonor. By the time Imperial Japan began its militaristic expansion in the 1930s, Bushido had been co-opted and weaponized by the government. No longer a noble personal code, it became a mandatory philosophy taught in schools and boot camps. Soldiers were taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, not just for themselves, but for their families, their ancestors, and even the emperor himself. To die in battle, preferably while shouting, "Tenno Heika Banzai," long live the emperor, was the ultimate expression of patriotism. This cultural programming wasn't optional. It was hammered into recruits from day one. Training was brutal and deliberately dehumanizing. Recruits were routinely beaten by their superiors, forced to recite oaths of loyalty, and subjected to psychological conditioning that celebrated death as the most glorious outcome. One Japanese general famously told his troops, "You must not return alive." Military manuals taught soldiers that to be taken prisoner was worse than being executed. Propaganda posters and radio broadcasts portrayed the Allied forces as sadistic demons who would torture any soldier who surrendered. In this environment, fear of dishonor became more powerful than fear of death. By the time Japan entered full-scale war with the Allies, this death cult had become doctrine. Officers carried swords not just for ceremony, but to execute subordinates who displayed cowardice or hesitation. Suicide charges, where soldiers were ordered to storm enemy lines with no hope of survival, became standard practice. But perhaps even more disturbing were the battlefield orders to die with spirit. Screaming during death wasn't just an emotional reaction. It was a trained final act of defiance, meant to terrify the enemy and express total devotion to the emperor. As the war raged across the Pacific, one of the most terrifying expressions of Japan's suicidal doctrine emerged: the banzai charge. These human wave assaults involved hundreds, or even thousands, of soldiers sprinting toward fortified Allied positions, often with bayonets fixed and grenades in hand, screaming the emperor's name at the top of their lungs. From a distance, it might have seemed like madness, but to the Japanese high command, these were tactical sacrifices intended to buy time, slow enemy advances, and uphold the myth of invincibility. The soldiers involved in these charges rarely expected to survive. Often, they were issued one-way rations. Many were forced to write letters home as if they were already dead. The screaming wasn't random. It was part of the theater. It created psychological shock on the battlefield, both for the attackers and the defenders. For the Japanese, it was a final release of fear and emotion. For Allied soldiers, the sound was nightmarish. One American Marine recalled in his memoir, "You could hear them coming, shouting, wailing like ghosts. And then they were on us, stabbing and slashing. It was like fighting the dead." These charges rarely achieved their objectives. At battles like Saipan, Peleliu, and Tarawa, they resulted in massive Japanese casualties with minimal Allied losses. But despite the futility, The practice continued, because it wasn't about winning, it was about dying the right way. Officers would sometimes shoot any soldier who hesitated to join the charge. Survivors were disgraced. And when a charge failed, the wounded often committed suicide in the field rather than be captured. Grenades were used not as weapons, but as tools for self-immolation, clutched to the chest with the pin pulled, sometimes even used on wounded comrades to prevent capture. By the final years of the war, Japan's battlefield losses were catastrophic, but the culture of death only grew stronger. It became ritualized. Screaming one's final words while charging into gunfire wasn't just permitted, it was expected. Entire units were trained to treat death as performance, a loud, violent, terrifying display of loyalty. Perhaps the most infamous expression of Japan's suicidal war culture came in the form of the kamikaze, pilots ordered to crash their planes into enemy ships in deliberate suicide attacks. These men were not given ejection seats. They were not meant to return. Selected for their youth and ideological purity, they were often told they were lucky, chosen for a sacred mission that would bring honor to their families. Before flying out, many would attend rituals, drink sake, write final poems, and pose for photographs. Smiling, brave, doomed. The government framed these missions as selfless acts of national salvation. Propaganda made it seem glorious, romantic. But behind the curtain, the truth was far darker. Many pilots were coerced or guilt-tripped into volunteering. If they refused, their careers were over. Their families were shamed. Some who tried to back out were threatened with death. One kamikaze pilot who survived because of a malfunction later said, "They trained us to believe that living was cowardice. I felt shame that I didn't die." The kamikaze were told to scream in their final moments, not just out of passion, but to unsettle their enemies. Pilots were instructed to shout "banzai" as they plunged into warships. Some even broadcast their final screams over radio frequencies. The psychological impact on Allied forces was immense. Sailors reported feeling helpless as planes dove straight at them, engines roaring, voices wailing. The horror wasn't just in the explosion. It was in knowing the person coming toward you wanted to die. By the end of the war, over 3,800 kamikaze pilots had died. Their attacks sank more than 30 Allied ships and damaged hundreds more. But strategically, the cost was far greater than the gain. It didn't matter. The goal wasn't victory, it was sacrifice. Japan's military leadership believed that enough sacred deaths might force the Allies to back down. Instead, it only hardened their resolve. As Japan began to lose its territorial grip in the Pacific, what became increasingly clear was that surrender, in any form, was not only discouraged, it was practically forbidden. Soldiers were often issued final orders to die with honor, and many carried grenades not for combat, but to ensure they could take their own lives if captured. In countless instances, on islands like Saipan, Guam, and Iwo Jima, entire units chose death rather than lay down arms. This wasn't merely loyalty, it was state-enforced psychological conditioning. Leaflets were distributed saying, "Don't bring shame to your family by being captured." And soldiers were repeatedly reminded that they must either die fighting or kill themselves. What made this doctrine even more disturbing was how often it extended to civilians. On Saipan, thousands of Japanese civilians, brainwashed by state propaganda, flung themselves off cliffs after U.S. landings, convinced that American soldiers would torture or enslave them. Mothers jumped holding their children. Fathers set fire to their homes. Loudspeakers blared messages of death before dishonor. And even Japanese soldiers encouraged civilians to leap. Some women were handed grenades and told to pull the pin as they hugged their children. The honorable death is a beautiful thing, one soldier reportedly said before he led a group of civilians to their deaths at Banzai Cliff. This mindset filtered through the ranks of the military, where officers were known to execute subordinates who hesitated in following suicidal orders. Some units kept written death oaths on their person, pledging to resist until the very end. In many cases, soldiers did not even attempt a tactical withdrawal if they were overrun. They would stay in caves and bunkers, lobbing grenades and firing blindly until the structure collapsed on top of them. Prisoners were not to be taken, either by them or of them. One captured Japanese officer told interrogators, "We are not taught to live after defeat." This scorched earth mentality directly contributed to the ferocity of battles across the Pacific. American commanders learned that surrender was so rare, it could not be expected. Flamethrowers, grenades, and high explosives became necessary tools to root out defenders who refused to give up. In turn, this only hardened Japanese soldiers' resolve to die screaming instead of surrendering quietly. The more the war turned against them, the more dramatic and terrifying their final acts became. One of the darkest elements of this story is how young Japanese boys, many still in their teens, were conditioned from childhood to embrace death for the emperor. Long before they ever put on a military uniform, they were already being primed for self-sacrifice. School books romanticized fallen soldiers as role models. Texts told of heroic deaths with joy and serenity. They were taught that to die for the nation was to become immortal. This brainwashing started in kindergarten and continued through adolescence. By the time they were 16 or 17, many believed that the greatest dream a boy could have was to die shouting, "Tenno Heika Banzai," in the name of the emperor. During the later years of the war, Japan was conscripting increasingly younger soldiers. Teenagers were thrown into combat on Okinawa, where they were issued barely functioning rifles or bamboo spears. They were placed in suicide squads and instructed to charge American tanks with explosives strapped to their bodies. One American Marine recalled, "They were just kids. They screamed and ran at us like banshees, their eyes wild. You could see the terror and devotion all mixed into one." At home, the government turned schools into indoctrination centers. Students rehearsed bayonet charges in playgrounds and practiced mock death runs. Girls were trained as nurses, and sometimes suicide attackers as well. When the American bombing campaigns reached the Japanese mainland, high school students were dispatched to work in military factories, and they too were told to die if the facility was invaded. There were drills on how to kill enemy soldiers using gardening tools, and toward the end of the war, plans were drafted for a massive civilian suicide campaign, where every Japanese citizen would become a martyr rather than face occupation. By mid-1945, Japanese radio broadcasts were openly preparing the population for national suicide. Millions of bamboo spears were issued. Propaganda told mothers to kill their children, and then themselves before the Americans arrived. This wasn't theoretical. It was government policy. When Japan lost Okinawa, the military still hoped to drag the Allies into a bloodbath so horrific it would force a negotiated peace. This strategy required millions to be ready to die. Not just soldiers, but civilians too. It was within this apocalyptic mindset that death became not a byproduct of war, but the goal itself. Screaming while charging enemy positions wasn't just for morale or terror. It was the last way to declare that you still had power, that you still had choice, and that your life belonged to the emperor alone. The war ended, but for those who survived, especially those trained to die, the psychological scars would never heal. Former kamikaze pilots who were grounded due to weather, mechanical failure, or war's end often described lifelong feelings of shame. Some were shunned by their communities for not completing their mission. Others found themselves unemployable, haunted by survivor's guilt, plagued by the realization that their lives had been deemed expendable by their own country. One former pilot later confessed in a rare interview, "They taught us that death was beautiful, but they didn't prepare us to live." Survivors of banzai charges and suicide missions found themselves in a strange limbo. They were treated as both heroes and ghosts, reminders of a national failure wrapped in honor. Many never spoke of their experiences. Some committed suicide in peacetime, unable to reconcile their survival with the deaths of their comrades. Even more complicated was Japan's relationship with its own war dead. The Yasukuni Shrine, where the spirits of fallen soldiers are enshrined, became a source of national controversy. Among the dead honored, there were kamikaze pilots and even convicted war criminals. The nation, still trying to rebuild from the ashes of defeat and atomic annihilation, had to decide whether these men were martyrs, victims, or brainwashed tools of an empire gone mad. In the decades following the war, films, books, and interviews began to shed light on just how intense and disturbing the indoctrination had been. Memoirs from former soldiers described being beaten for crying during training or for hesitating before suicide drills. A handful of veterans became vocal critics of the war, revealing how they had been manipulated into believing that their deaths would change the course of history. The cultural consequences lingered for generations. Japan's post-war constitution renounced war entirely, and many in the country swore never to glorify military sacrifice again. Yet for years, school textbooks barely acknowledged the extent of the suicide doctrine. Only in recent decades has open discussion about the war's emotional and spiritual toll become more common. Still, the images remain. Men sprinting through smoke, screaming with grenades in hand, teenagers diving planes into ships, civilians leaping from cliffs. It wasn't just about dying, it was about dying loud, dying visibly, and dying in a way that the enemy and the world would never forget. The kamikaze were the most infamous result of Japan's death before surrender doctrine. Officially called the Tokotai, or Special Attack Units, they were young men ordered to fly their aircraft directly into enemy ships, knowing they would be reduced to fire and metal within seconds. What made it even more disturbing was how ceremonial and manipulative this process was. Pilots were often paraded before takeoff, given white headbands, sips of sake, and letters to their mothers. Propaganda films showed them smiling, laughing, supposedly proud to die. But many were terrified. Some cried in silence. One former pilot, who survived because his plane malfunctioned, revealed in an interview, "We were told our lives meant nothing, that Japan was already gone, and our death would be a final gift." The recruitment wasn't always voluntary. As the war dragged on, the pressure to volunteer became impossible to resist. Officers used guilt, peer pressure, and fear to push boys as young as 17 into suicide missions. In many cases, it wasn't about fanatical loyalty. It was about not shaming your family or facing public humiliation. Pilots knew they were being sent in outdated planes with little to no armor and massive bombs attached to their bellies. They also knew the U.S. Navy had learned how to shoot them down before they got close. Despite this, the Japanese military invested everything into the kamikaze program. Over 3,800 pilots would die in these suicide attacks, and while they caused damage, sinking or damaging over 400 Allied ships, they didn't stop the tide of war. Still, their effectiveness in instilling fear was immense. U.S. soldiers reported intense dread whenever a plane dove from the sky. "It wasn't about what the plane would do," one Marine said. "It was about knowing that guy chose to die just to kill you. It messes with your head." But again, the screaming, the final cry, was part of the tactic. Many pilots were instructed to yell "banzai" through their radios just before impact. It was psychological warfare, a terrifying audio reminder that these were not enemies seeking survival, but enemies weaponizing their own deaths. And when they missed or were shot down, they were buried quietly, forgotten by the military that had once held ceremonies in their honor. The phrase "die screaming" wasn't metaphorical. It was drilled into the very conduct of Japanese battlefield tactics. Screaming, yelling, and frenzied charges, known as banzai attacks, became common, especially when units ran out of ammunition or were cornered. These suicide charges were meant to frighten, overwhelm, and disrupt enemy formations through chaos. They were not strategic. They were a last, desperate act of devotion and defiance. On islands like Saipan, Peleliu, and Guadalcanal, banzai attacks would often come at night. Waves of soldiers, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, would rise from the jungle, weapons drawn, faces painted, and run at American lines while screaming at the top of their lungs. The psychological toll was massive. U.S. troops described the sound of these attacks as the most terrifying thing in the Pacific. One recalled, "You'd hear the drums first, then the screaming, then the bodies coming through the trees." It wasn't just about the charge. Even dying soldiers were trained to scream, to draw attention, to cause distraction, and to inspire the next wave. Dying with silence was seen as shameful. Dying with fury was considered a contribution to the mission. The use of screaming also had cultural roots. In traditional samurai lore, the death yell, or kiai, was considered a spiritual release of energy, a final defiance against the enemy, and a way to honor death. The Imperial Army adopted this into their military ethos, and once it entered battlefield doctrine, it became a requirement, not a choice. In some battles, commanders even punished soldiers who died quietly. Reports show that families were denied honors or pensions if their sons were deemed to have died passively. This cultural obsession with a loud, visible, and honorable death distorted the very nature of bravery. By 1945, screaming while dying wasn't just expected, it was militarized. Yet, ironically, it also revealed just how broken the Japanese war machine had become. When screams replace strategy and death replaces survival, a nation is no longer fighting to win. It's fighting not to admit it lost. After the war, Japan surrendered unconditionally. But what followed was not a national reckoning over the culture of suicidal warfare. It was silence. Deep, echoing silence. The surviving soldiers, pilots, and civilians who had been trained to die didn't find honor or answers in the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They found confusion, trauma, and societal neglect. Japan's post-war government was more focused on rebuilding than on healing. The stories of suicidal training, death oaths, and battlefield screams were buried. School textbooks glossed over the horrors. The nation, in many ways, erased its own soldiers. And yet, some tried to speak out. Survivors of kamikaze units published memoirs in the 1970s and 1980s, revealing how manipulated and terrified they had been. Others gave tearful interviews, admitting they still dreamed of the friends they watched die. One former soldier, when asked if he regretted surviving, simply said, "Every day. Because they told us we were cowards if we came back." Even today, the topic remains sensitive in Japan. Monuments to fallen suicide soldiers exist, but they are visited more by tourists than by citizens. The official narrative often omits the psychological abuse that trained teenagers to die screaming. And in many families, the names of lost sons are remembered in private, without fanfare or pride. For historians and documentary creators, the challenge is balancing respect for those who were victims of a cruel system, with the need to expose how far a country went to weaponize death itself. Japan's soldiers weren't all fanatics. Many were scared kids, lied to by their leaders, trapped in a code of honor that didn't allow for survival. This story isn't about glorifying screams in war. It's about understanding why they happened. Because when death becomes doctrine and screams become strategy, we don't just lose lives, we lose humanity.